On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Clark Downum. He is the CTO at Redox. We're going to be talking about culture and delivery, and we're going to focus on success and failure. And I think a lot of times within the engineering and technology space, there's a lot of pressure, maybe some burden that we're supposed to learn a lot about the business. So we're going to talk about, does the business reciprocate, and would that help? And we're going to also talk about when you are dealing with these projects, and obviously sometimes we're not seeing success, where does that burden fall? And how do you kind of bridge this gap? How do you actually deliver better results? So hope to cover as much as we can with you, Clark. Thanks for taking the time.
No, my pleasure, Amir. Really glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Okay, before we start, tell us what Redox does.
Yeah, so Redox is a healthcare data exchange platform. We connect disparate systems that want to exchange healthcare data, usually to EMRs, but also to payer systems and others. We exchange about 1 billion patient records every month. So that's what we do in a nutshell.
Awesome. All right. I'm sure that keeps you busy. I'm sure lots of moving parts. And I guess in terms of this episode, we're going to be chatting about culture and delivery, right? But really what we're talking about is that success and failure. And let's maybe talk about that. So maybe you could describe a little bit about your team and how you guys are just set up in terms of just the your team's engineering organization.
Yeah, so I think probably there's not a lot of mystery there. We organize by squads. The squads own certain functional areas. We do have one that's more focused on the cloud infrastructure, the CI/CD pipeline, one that's more focused on backend, and then we have two full stack squads. We're more backend oriented application. And we have a product management function that sits alongside us and helps support us as we try and deliver outcomes that move the business forward.
Awesome. I guess when it comes to your team, and you're within the healthcare space, there's a lot of complexities there. It is a common understanding that engineers come in and they ramp up on understanding the industry there. And I guess talk to us a little bit about that ramp up period for somebody joining the company.
It is a very complicated space, and I would say our ecosystem itself is very complicated. And what we've tried to do over the years is move from a state, when we were a much younger startup. I think we had the classic problems of really poor documentation, whatever. We tended to hire people from the industry, so the learning curve was a bit lower. And since that time, really what we focused on is simplifying our tech stack. I think if you were to ask some of our engineers, they might say, I don't understand the business and what we do as well as I would like to. That I find tend to take time. What we instead focus on is making sure that they're able to understand the systems that they're working in, understand how we want them to change or evolve those systems, and really allow them more over time to understand the business and how we're having an impact. A lot of the impact that we have is indirect, so that just makes that kind of understanding one step further, which is very hard for people in practice.
Absolutely. I guess within the organization, you obviously are engaging with a lot of businesses, your stakeholders internal to the company. When it comes to dealing with stakeholders, and maybe even externally facing, how often do you see an interest in the engineering process? Is it something that people ask you about it, or is it just expected that you just go off and do what you do and come back and show and tell when you have something?
I would say it's much more the latter, except for when something's going wrong. And then everyone wants to know everything, which is a very frustrating space to find yourself in. I think, a lot of my colleagues, my peers, stakeholders are very busy. They've got their own, things they're trying to accomplish for the business. And the truth is, my understanding of engineering processes and how to deliver and how we go about things has been built over years and years and years of doing it every day. It's not really reasonable to expect them to contain that similar level of knowledge, just as I don't know the details of how to do marketing or the complexities of a sale. And so most of the time, I think they do just want us to go away and deliver, much as I think I'm like, great, go away and hit your ARR goals, right? And of course, when something does go wrong, whether it is on the sales side or the engineering side, then people really want to dig in and understand what the heck is happening here. And they want to make sure you understand, right? Like, do you know what's going on? And your ability to respond to them in a way that they feel good about is one of the key indicators of, do you know what's going on or not? So I do have that. And I think, if you do get in that situation, one, it helps to educate before something goes wrong as much as you can. And two, know when something is going wrong, you need to focus on how do you communicate that to them. And that's really going to mean taking a lot of maybe the nuances or the subtlety and moving it away and finding analogies that work for them that connect to some of the experiences that they have on the commercial side so that they just intuitively understand where you're coming from and what happened. And most importantly, what are you doing to get it back on track, if that's possible? I think one of the mistakes that we made for a long time is we would try and solve a lot of problems ourselves, right? So a project starts to get delayed. Maybe we pull capacity from over here or work with product to scope some things down a little bit, et cetera, to try and preserve the delivery date, which is mostly what the business cares about, honestly. And only after we've exhausted our capabilities to do that, do we then bring it up to people and say, hey, we're going to need to extend this. Well, what they hear is first response is it's delayed, right? So we've gotten better at showing all our work and saying we've tried X, Y, and Z, and we're still at this place. And that's actually gone much smoother when you do provide that context to everyone.
As you're speaking, I'm going to come back to the context and the delays and the scope in a second. But I brought this up a couple times with people. I used to be a software engineer, and I remember in my days, you'd sit down and talk to the stakeholder. Invariably, your mind starts drifting to the technical solution. You start building out the solution in your head as you're hearing the requirements. In hindsight, now that I'm far removed from those days, sometimes I look back and I go, during that process, was I starting to tune out the business? Was I starting to, diminish my active listening to them and their problems while I'm trying to architect a solution? Whereas I could have gone off and done that. And I don't know if that's a contributor to why projects have issues, right? I'm not going to say that is it, but I am kind of curious because that's if I talk to 100 technology people, 99 will say they do that. We're so ingrained to do that. Does that help us or is that maybe hurting us? And I know this is kind of like a left field question, but just kind of curious.
Hey, look, left field questions are totally fine. So I do the same thing. And I agree with you. It's super ingrained in us. And I think it's most appropriate actually when you're being asked to give a swag, how hard is this? Yes or no, right? Then it's appropriate to start architecting it through your head and making a guess. Otherwise, I think you're right that there is a huge risk that you stop active listening and you get too involved in your own mental processes. And what I would say is actually the much more insidious thing is the teams do that themselves through execution, right? They get wrapped up in the technology choice that they want to make. They get wrapped up in all these sorts of things and they forget the core business outcome that they're trying to deliver. So I would say the key lesson there is not just as you're talking to stakeholders, unless you are being asked to give a swag, focus on active listening, try and shut out the architecture part and just ask questions. Also with the team, you gotta every week, what is the outcome we're going for? What is not relevant to help them focus on that? Otherwise, they'll get wrapped up in the technology details that really matter to us, right? They affect our future lives, but maybe they're not what the business is going for right now. And you just got to reorient around that North Star. What is the outcome we're trying to achieve for the business? And how do we assess whether the things that we're worried about do impact that core outcome or don't? And if they don't, let's move on.
That really resonates with me because we have a couple of Macs in the house and we have Time Machine set up and the hard drive's aging and I need to replace it. And it's been about a month of me telling my wife I'm going to replace it. And I noticed, she asked, am I close? And I noticed that I've gone deep from, I'm just going to buy one hard drive to I'm going to look at RAID, NAS. And I am so far down the rabbit hole of redundancy. And she's like, you do realize that these are also stored in the cloud. It's just for convenience. And I'm like, that's so true. That's so true. As you mentioned, we get wrapped up. I want to pull in a question around tech debt in this notion of we get wrapped up within these details because sometimes as engineers, we really want to not just build the solution, we want to build the solution correctly, not the right solution, but the solution right. I guess when you're looking at your teams, and the reason I'm pulling this is because we're talking about success, culture, delivery, these projects succeeding and failing, and I'm now kind of, you're making me think of okay, well, what if we delivered the less than elegant solution, but it got the job done. And we threw away the notion of tech debt. Forget it. It doesn't matter. If this is incorrectly scaled and we actually really need this down the road, we can always re-architect and re-engineer if the business value is there. I'm curious, just kind of your thoughts if you were to expand on that.
Yeah, this is a great question, and I think one that comes up a lot. I think, just to answer directly, I agree with generally speaking, try and throw out the notion of tech debt. There was one of the kind of more famous engineers, and his name escapes me at the moment, who had a rule for tech debt that was update and refactor the code that you're working in and not if you're not, more or less. And really, that really focuses you on the business value implicitly, because if the business isn't actively needing to advance an area of code, you're not touching it, right? And actually, this is one area where I think the business not reciprocating, understanding what's going on in engineering is super valuable. My team complains constantly about tech debt. Every team I've ever been on complains constantly about tech debt, honestly. It's a very natural thing for us. And I think the fact that the business doesn't know what tech debt is and isn't going to learn what tech debt is super valuable, because it means you can't say tech debt and wave away what you actually mean, right? You have to be super clear about what it is and why it's a problem in order to have that conversation with the business owner who doesn't know what tech debt is. I think that is a very valuable exercise to ground yourselves in what is the return on the money we are going to spend, the business's dollars, in order to make a change here. And that's a very necessary component to understand and then elevate into the conversation. Otherwise, you can just spend forever refactoring something, and then you just are literally a cost center that's not adding any value. And that is not a good place to be as a team. So I think that's actually super valuable to have a business not reciprocating there to push you on that, because I think we're so in tune with tech debt that we actually use it to not get at what we're talking about, and we just wave it away. Of course, we don't want tech debt. But really, you need that 1, 2, 3 layer click that a business owner forces you into, because they don't buy into tech debt as a concept.
Yeah, I think we've all run into that situation where you have a contractor at your home and they're like, well, I could do this for this, but if you want me to do it right so that it's here for the next 75 years, I need to do all these other things. And quickly you're like, well, and to your point, not understanding that, but actually understanding the value is really key. From your perspective, when you're working with your teams from an engineering culture perspective, how do you work to prevent this? Because I think, yeah, I know this is a big one, and I'm not sure that and it doesn't matter if we don't have the answer, but obviously we have the project manager triangle, right? We have scope, budget, time. We've kind of talked a little bit about scope and talking to the business. We talked about time, and you mentioned about scaling down scope sometimes as well. And I guess when we're talking about this bigger concept of tech debt, to actually be like, listen, guys, let's fight our natural instincts to want to do this thing a more elegant way so that we don't have to touch it, but let's get it in the hands of the users. Is that a cultural thing? Is that something where we have to just naturally fight against every engineer's instinct and it is a losing battle? Or is it a cultural thing where we can potentially message that down, that it's okay?
I would say there is a cultural improvement that could be made. I don't know if we can ever fully get away from the instinct. And I think culturally, what I would say, you've triggered me to wonder how my team perceives how I operate in this space now. So I'm going to follow up on that. But, I think really one of the most explicit things to align everyone around is we're always going to have tech debt, right? It's kind of like a systematic version of what person wrote this code so poorly, 6 months ago, and you look and you made the commit and you're like, oh, crap, right? So you are going to have tech debt, right? If for no other reason, the perspectives and standards just change and evolve. And the question to orient the team around is, what tech debt do we thoughtfully want to take on versus not, right? Because you're always going to have it. And then that helps to get into a conversation around, is this a totally new piece of functionality and we really don't understand it, so we know we're going to iterate? Is this core to our value delivery? And if there's a problem here in 6 months, we're in deep trouble. Right. And I think that exercise of trying to make it an informed discussion where you are going to deliberately take on tech debt or not, and getting the engineers thinking about that in that way helps bring a perspective of this is a trade-off we're consciously choosing to make, and your perspectives are valid here, knowing what we need to accomplish for the business. And I would say, we talk internally about, time, budget, and scope, but also quality. Quality is another lever that you can pull in that equation. And I consider tech debt and conscious choice of tech debt to be a part of the quality bucket. Not the only thing, but a part of it.
I like that. I'm gonna borrow that now. I'm gonna change it from a triangle to the project management rectangle. You've brought up a couple of things that maybe I'd like to follow up on, and maybe this is going to be more going back to the business and the product owners, because obviously Scrum and Agile methodology were created in response to we can't estimate the future, and engineers are not always going to be accurate, and that we're being held to standards and timelines that we just don't know with scope and budget and time kind of fixed. Obviously, we said from a technical perspective, they don't need to completely understand what's happening underneath the hood to reciprocate that. When it comes to owning the scope, obviously we set up a backlog, we establish a product owner. I'm not really sure always that they really understand what being a product owner means, that they have certain choices, but then they really don't have certain choices. When we look at that, and we look at that part of the equation of understanding that scope up front and giving them that opportunity to justify business value and give the technical team something to work on, that does put a little bit more pressure back on the product owner, puts a little bit more onus on them to define those parameters clearly. I feel that sometimes technical teams absorb some of that too much, and hence why we're doing solution architecting while we're listening to the requirements, because we know we're going to have to estimate those within a short period of time. That dynamic seems less than ideal still. When you look at that dynamic, and we're talking about success and failure of these projects, is there something we could do from the engineering side to help provide the product owners a better clarity in terms of their decisions and potentially helping them evaluate their choices better?
I think there is. And I actually want to rewind a little bit before getting to your answer. And you talked about Scrum and Agile being a response to estimates, and we can't know. And I think that's true. There is an element of uncertainty in estimates, and that's a tough one to convey to people. But for me, really, what I would say I feel, and this is a hot take, and I'm sure people are going to disagree with me, I think Agile was more a response to we can't make a perfect plan. And so you have to be open to changing the plan as you learn more. And I think that's the thing to embrace that will help the product owners, right? That and the combination of people over process. You should be constantly talking with your product owner as you learn more, and knowing upfront and set the expectation the plan will change. The scope that you want and we agree to today will not be the final scope delivered, nor will anything else about what we imagine in our heads. Not anything, but right, it will change, and you're going to be a part of that discussion. And then I think the other thing that we do, and I've seen this happen and cause confusion in my company, is you need to set the expectation, or what is the level of conviction behind your estimate. I think if you don't give the engineering team some calibration around what's your level of confidence you're looking for in the estimate, they'll over-index on being perfect, right? Often, I think your first conversation with a product person about a scope decision is, my hot take is that's easy, that's hard, right? And then that comes back to the implicit question, which you should make explicit. How much do you care about this thing that I think is hard? How hard should I work to make that easy, right? Because how you imagine delivery dramatically affects the impact. Are you going to build it yourself, or do I need to spend an hour Google searching for a package that does it for me, right? And so what we've actually had happen, which is sort of embarrassing, but you need to normalize, is a requirement happens. There's something declared out of scope to the business owners because engineering says it'll take 3 months or whatever. Our customer success counterparts, our sales counterparts, like, come on, we've got to have this. Comes back, it'll take 3 days, right? And everyone's like, what the heck, Clark? And I'm like, it was not thought to be an important thing before. right? So you got to convey that and have that conversation of how important is this to you or not, and how hard should I work to make the cost as small as I can versus I think that's hard. At least that's the heuristic that I use. I don't know if that resonates with you or not, but that's kind of how I think about that.
No, I actually think, and I agree with you. I think, I think there's more to Agile. I kind of simplified, the high level, and I do agree with you that sometimes when engineers come back and they shift their timeline, that's hard because then I think stakeholders always are wondering, well, is that the long view or the short view of how this could be done, and why would that timeline shift? And that is hard because it does put a different expectation of the next thing that's similar to the stakeholder. So I think that's 100%, and it's hard. Like, we call it computer
You got to
science.
frame that very hard or very carefully, right? When you come back and say that thing we thought would take 3 months will take 2 days, you need to explain why, because otherwise you're just setting up the dynamic of if I push you hard enough, magic will happen. That's not a healthy dynamic.
Yeah, and I think that's where some of this the culture aspect we're talking about, I think you actually clarified it, is actually determining what's easy, what's hard, and how much time do you want me to spend to make the hard easy. I think that's really actually a great takeaway, and from what we've been talking about. And I guess the more we've been talking, we were gonna touch on obviously these projects that don't succeed, things that don't succeed, and is the burden on the technical side. I think just while I've been listening to it, obviously I don't think there's one side that that takes the culpability, but certainly it sounds like this dynamic, which has been in place, and these statistics of project failures have been in place long enough where we still haven't seen somebody address some of the core, which I think you've done a great job of outlining some of the core issues that we're not potentially seeing eye to eye on. I wonder why we don't spend more time addressing the business side problems that the engineers could possibly help with. Or I don't know if that question makes sense, but I do wonder if we're not helping the business understand these failure points well enough so that we can kind of look at the root cause a bit more.
I would say that's a very healthy attitude to have. And my view on this is kind of almost similar to how I think about free will. It's sort of irrelevant whether one does or doesn't have free will. You should just act like you do, because everything will be better if you make that assumption. I think the burden being on the technical side is the right assumption for us to have, regardless of how true it is or isn't, and to do everything that we can to help reduce the risk of failure. I think as well, a lot of times probably people don't spend enough time working with the business around this and setting good expectations and really making sure that business understands this is going to be a constant conversation. What's on track? What's off track? Do you care about this? Do you not care about that? And I think the other thing that really is important to start normalizing around, and I really adore my product leader for this, the business by default, in my experience, most businesses I've talked to or been a part of view engineering, shipping a thing on the date as the key measure of engineering. And I think what you can quickly get alignment on is if you say, that is important, absolutely, right? We need to understand time is precious and time kills all deals. But what we really care about collectively is impact. And what we're going to come to you with is a conversation around functionality, cost, time, and quality. And we're going to together solve what makes the most sense to get the best impact we can get. And sometimes that's going to mean time extends. Sometimes that's going to mean, hey, I talked with this group and I think we're missing a core requirement here. We need to increase scope, right? But that focus on impact and what you really want to do, right? Drive the core business deliverable is the thing to orient people around. And then you can have a rational discussion around what do we collectively want to do to move forward. I think where you cause a lot of frustration is when you have an engineering team have decided time is the lever we're going to pull. Like, that is not an appropriate decision for an engineering team to make. It is appropriate to say, we can do one of these 4 things. What do you think? And to not promise a fantasy. But I think it is a business decision, and you should treat it as a collaborative one of what's the best path we all see forward, would be my recommendation to people.
Fantastic. I love it. What a great conversation, Clark. I really appreciate your time and your
Well, thank you
views
for
and your
having me here.
opinions. Absolutely. If someone's going to want to touch base with you, connect with you, to want to ask you something we discussed, what is a good way of doing that?
Yeah, I think there's two great ways. One is I'm on LinkedIn. I think I'm the only Clark Downum in the world. So if you search for me, you should find me. The other is I'm Clark at redoxengine.com. If you just want to email me directly, that'd be great.
Okay. We'll include some of those in the show notes. Again, thanks for being on the show. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you so much, Amir. Talk again soon.
Absolutely. All right. That's it for this episode. Be back again. Different guest, different topic. Definitely two things I want you to consider. One, this episode was great. I think we talked about a lot of the culture within an engineering org, success and failure of these projects. We talked about delivery, product owners, stakeholders, and we talked about that relationship. And I don't know if we talk about it enough on platforms like this. So I was really glad when Clark wanted to cover this topic, but share this episode with another engineering leader, actually somebody else within engineering, because I think we talked about these concepts, and I think everyone needs to revisit them. And I'd really love to see more people actually be involved on that business side, understanding as kind of Clark has outlined. I think it'd be great. So please share this episode out there. Also, like, subscribe, comment. Let me know how you guys like the show. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.